Good afternoon and welcome to this Global US Brain Trust Dialogue. The Brain Trust goal is to bring to you the latest scientific, social, and policy agendas. By bringing together leaders in science, industry, patient advocacy, and philanthropy, we want to achieve greater awareness and demonstrate the benefits of investing in brain health, in particular in women's brain health. Preventing the disease before it starts and thereby preserving our brain and mental health needs to be top of mind for all of us. Today's topic is Journey from Diagnosis to Treatment of Dementia, Current Clinical Practice and Lived Experience. With the remarkable advances that recently have achieved in AD research, our discussion should be of great interest to all of you. Now, I would like to welcome the panelists and have them introduce themselves. First, please, Dr. Giovanni Frisoni.
Giovanni Frisoni, neurologist. I've been working in Italy at the National Center for Alzheimer's Disease for 20 years, taking care of patients with dementia and Alzheimer's. And since 10 years, I'm leading the memory clinic in Geneva, at Geneva University Hospital. And I see myself as a translational clinical scientist. In other words, I try to take the innovations in science and technology and bring them to clinical fruition to improve patients' diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment.
Thank you, Giovanni. And now, please, Dr. Rebecca Job.
I'm Rebecca Chop. I was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2018. I had to step down from a very wonderful, incredible career in higher education. Now I live in northern Colorado next to the mountains with my husband. In 2022, I co-founded the Voices of Alzheimer's. I do all I can to give voice to this disease and to encourage those with Alzheimer's and their care partners to live well and to live with joy.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this touching statement. And now let's welcome and hear from our final panelist, Dr. Rachel Buckley.
Hello, my name is Rachel Buckley. I'm an assistant professor of neurology at Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. I completed my PhD in Australia and then was able to come across to complete my training under the National Institutes of Health funding to train at Harvard. I now run my own lab where we're really interested in understanding the drivers of sex differences in Alzheimer's disease risk. Everything from twinkle to wrinkle. We look at the X chromosome all the way to menopause and beyond.
Thank you all. As you can tell from this touching brief introduction, this journey is about to change dramatically from the first disease-modifying treatments to significantly slow progression of early Alzheimer's disease to, in fact, diagnostic tools that will be soon available to predict who is at risk for developing the disease 10 to 20 years before the symptoms appear. All of these evolutions will change the journey from diagnosis to treatment of dementia to the final goal, which is prevention of dementia. And as we should see full approval of the two disease-modifying therapeutics, hopefully very soon, there will be a growing interest in knowing if one should get a diagnosis and how to best navigate this journey. And with these short remarks, I would like now to welcome a long-term colleague and friend, Dr. Giovanni Frisoni. Giovanni, it's hard to describe your career, but just let me say that you are a globally recognized expert in amyloid imaging, accurate diagnosis, targeted therapy, but you're also working on the patient's life by working on recommendations and approaches to definitely and efficiently implement the latest research, make them available to the patients to have them the best treatment. Let me come to my first question. Today, you are directing a memory clinic and interact daily with people who are living with dementia and their families. Can you briefly describe the journey from a clinician's perspective and the challenges you face on a daily basis?
Sure. In memory clinics, patients go through an interview with an MD or a psychologist. Then they undergo a neurological exam with an MD specialist, and then move on to a detailed test of memory and other functions, brain MRI, and sometimes more advanced tests such as lumbar puncture, PET, brain PET, or brain SPECT scan. What I perceive as a challenge in my daily work, however, is not the technical part, but communication and the emotional part. What is challenging is not explaining how a lumbar puncture is performed, but overcoming the cultural stereotypes and the historical fears associated with lumbar puncture. It's not explaining what a neuropsychological battery consists of, but making people overcome the frustration of doing mistakes during the tests. It's not explaining how an MR scanner works, but having claustrophobic people overcome the fear of being trapped in a tube. But if you allow me, an even tougher challenge is teaching people to see, hear, smell, feel, fear, and enjoy the world like a patient with Alzheimer's. Because the vast majority of people with Alzheimer's can enjoy life, provided someone gives reassurance, practical support, not too little, not too much, and above all, emotional closeness. Understanding this helps patients and family discover a new way of enjoying life. It's not easy, I admit, but it can be done. And I've seen it done a number of times.
Yeah, thank you so much. Me too. And I'm looking forward to what Rebecca will tell us later about her experience. Now, since we have a sort of changing environment, we have now disease-modifying treatments available, so more and more people might consider diagnosis. So what advice would you give to someone who is considering a diagnosis, either for themselves or for family members? What do they have to prepare for?
Well, of course, seek a most competent specialist, someone who manages the most advanced technology, but most of all, do not do it alone. Make sure that you're accompanied by someone whom you love and trust and who loves and values you. And if there is no one with these characteristics in your life, you may wish to choose the person closest to this description, or to try and fix once and for all some broken relationship that oftentimes grow by living together with someone. People should remember that when you have Alzheimer's, you badly need someone who really cares for you. This would be my my warmest advice to people.
Yeah, how true this is. Are there differences between men and women when they see you, the way how they approach you, the way how they cope with a dementia diagnosis?
Yes, well, what I've most often observed in my clinical practice is that women, much more often than men, are concerned about being a weight to the family, to their family. I've heard much more often from women than men sentences like, if I have Alzheimer's, I will opt in for euthanasia. Or, I do not want my kids to know that I have Alzheimer's, as this would be too hard on them. Or, I'd rather go to a nursing home rather than be a burden to my family. One can make a number of hypotheses why this is the case, but I believe that cultural norms and habits may play a role. In Western and many non-Western societies, women are generally those who give help, while men, I'm one of those, are generally those who receive help. And I find this women's attitude to diagnosis thought-provoking, but also, if you allow me, deeply moving.
So if you have a woman in front of you with all the caring aspects about the family and not being a burden, what advice do you give her?
Well, again, if you as a woman, if you have someone with whom you have shared your life, with whom you have shared your fears, anguish, your hopes for the future, and someone who really cares for you, you share this moment. This is going to be a life-changing moment. Don't do it alone. You can we will change the way you see life, the way you enjoy life, but it's a different way of enjoying. It's the way of enjoying life will need someone who will be helping you, who will be a crutch. We usually do not need a crutch to enjoy life when we don't have Alzheimer's. When we have Alzheimer's, we need a crutch, but with a crutch, and I'm meaning someone to help you in your daily life, life can be enjoyed as without Alzheimer's, sometimes even more, because you can discover some facets of a person that were hidden by cultural norms, by the rules, by the work, by the way one has to behave.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have seen this actually in friends, families. People enjoy life, but they need the help, and we should come back to that with Rebecca. The good news is that recently, November and now May, 2 treatments for Alzheimer, disease-modifying treatments, which can really slow down the progression of the disease, have been significantly identified, significant changes. So there is definitely hope that in early Alzheimer, we can delay the progression. So how will these approvals, which we are expecting very soon, change the clinical practice, and when?
Well, actually, this is the time I've been looking for the past 30-something years. Till now, we had drugs which were like aspirin for pneumonia. Now we have what antibiotics are to pneumonia. We have drugs acting on the very causal core of Alzheimer's. And these drugs will radically transform not only the way we treat patients, but first and foremost, the way we think of the disease. They will change the societal narrative of Alzheimer's, which will be finally one of a condition that is not due to aging, but it's merely associated with aging. It's something that takes place at a given age, which is older age, but it's not like aging. It's not a matter of semantics. There's a world of a difference. And these drugs will also gradually take away the stigma of a disease that deprives you of the very core of what means being human and cannot be cured. Because now it will be curable. But maybe even more important, they will pave the way to secondary prevention. What do I mean by that? We are on our way to turn Alzheimer's into not only a curable disease, which is already something huge, but also a preventable one. We're working to develop the second generation memory clinics, where Alzheimer's will be prevented in persons with normal, in persons of my age, of your age, Andrea, but at high risk, rather than, as we do now, delaying the progression of memory impairment once memory impairment is already there.
Yeah, as you well know, this is one of my biggest preoccupation, to actually go to this prevention phase, because as we know, you cannot replace brain cells. You need to, in fact, prevent that we are dying. So this is really where we need to go. We need to prevent that the brain structure and the brain health is being affected by this disease. So this is really where we're going, and I'm so happy that you are believing this as much as I do. Now, let me come to the last question. I mean, in particular in Europe, are we actually ready to take these new drugs on? Do we have the infrastructure, or what needs to happen so that you can make this available to patients?
Yes, there's a number of changes that will need to take place also in the minds of physicians. Well, first, we should resist the temptation. We as a specialist, we should resist the temptation to offer the drug to as many patients as possible and start treating those relatively few patients who are closer to the clinical trial population, where the drugs have been shown to be effective and more tolerated. We should treat the patient when there is a real indication to treatment. This will let us, specialists, build familiarity with these new technological tools. Drugs are technological tools, after all, and will give society a reassuring message of caution that we do not want to treat anyone who has memory problems, but only those who can benefit most. The infrastructure, well, the infrastructure is not ready. We should gradually expand the capability of memory clinics to offer perfusions and close follow-ups every month or every 2 weeks even. And the future of memory clinics will be similar to clinics for multiple sclerosis or cancer, where patients come often in the first months of treatment and later on, probably less frequently. Then you've mentioned reimbursement. Well, as to reimbursement, I suspect that visions may differ significantly between the EU and US. As a European, I believe that reimbursement is not a clinical decision. It's a political decision taken by politicians on behalf of the whole society. What we, as a specialist, should do is to work with patient advocates and society at large to honestly and transparently identify the patient who can benefit the most, quantify this benefit, estimate the potential number of candidates for treatment, and feed this information to politicians. This is the information that politicians need to make simulation of the cost to society. And this is what we as specialists and together with patients, we should do to allow politicians make informed decisions.
Yep. We come back to this, Giovanni, at the end of our dialogue. Now, joining us to interview our next guest is Mel Comer, co-founder of Yes Against Alzheimer, member of the Global Brain Trust and author of the New York Times bestseller, Slow Dancing with a Stranger, Lost and Found in the Age of Alzheimer, a remarkable book. Mel.
Thank you, Andrea. I was struck by Dr. Frazzoni's comments. 50% of people today go undiagnosed and many live alone. So he painted a picture of an optimum solution. Our next guest, Dr. Rebecca Chop, was far too modest. She had a storied academic career. She was the first woman chancellor at the University of Denver. She was also the president of Swarthmore and Colgate College, and a theologian and dean at the Yale Divinity School. So Rebecca, now with your credits that are well due, thank you for joining us. You've heard Dr. Frazzoni talk. Tell us how you are doing now and where are you in the disease?
Well, thank you. You know, I just want to underscore that every case is unique. I'm in the early stages. I was very fortunate to be diagnosed early. So I'm in the MCI, the mild cognitive impairment stages. I enjoy life. I have hobbies. I get to walk and hike. I enjoy having the time to be with my husband and be with my son and friends. I mean, it's not all perfect. As Giovanni said, you know, I have to have crutches. I have my son drive me most of the time. I get very confused about time, especially. And I sleep a lot. I'm one of those people who slept 4 or 5 hours. I sleep 10 or 11 hours, and I have to avoid large social gatherings. But despite all that, I do live with joy.
Rebecca, let's go back to the time of diagnosis. Two doctors both gave you different advice on how to manage your living in this disease. What were they, and were you misdiagnosed as well?
Well, I really wasn't misdiagnosed. I went, my annual physician figured out something was wrong. I hadn't really put 2 and 2 together. She sent me through testing. I ended up with the neurologist number 1. She was very brusque. She told me I had MCI with Alzheimer's. And when we asked her, my husband was with me, when we asked her what I could do, she said really nothing. And my husband said, well, what should we expect? And she said, well, 3 to 4 years, you probably won't be buttoning your clothes or feeding yourself. I decided to look for a new neurologist, and I found a great one. She took the time to explain the disease. She showed me my brain charts. She talked at length to me, and she said, live with joy. She talked to me and wrote a prescription for lifestyle intervention, creativity, diet, exercise, lots of exercise, at least 2 hours a day, she said, social engagement, intellectual engagement, but most of all, live with joy. I kept that neurologist.
Rebecca, Alzheimer's runs in your family on the maternal side, and the risk profile of those of us who have someone with the disease on the maternal side is higher. You're writing a book called It's Not Your Grandmother's Alzheimer's. What's different now, and do we have to be careful not to sugarcoat this disease?
We shouldn't sugarcoat this disease. This disease is tragic, and I'm so glad to hear the positive words that someday we will be able to prevent this disease. But you know, that stigma, it's like a binary thing, right? Mm-hmm. You get that diagnosis, and like my first doctor said, that's what most of us think. It's binary. I'm healthy. Now I have Alzheimer's. And in fact, now it's different from my grandmother, because in those days, they just diagnosed when you were in very later stages and there was nothing to do. Now it's different as people are more and more like me. They get diagnosed in early stages. And there are things we can do. There are medications, as Giovanni expressed, but there are also lifestyle interventions. So my book is about getting over that stigma, that cultural norms, that you have Alzheimer's, just sit down and die. My book is how to enjoy life. It talks about the research in layperson's terms that I underwent. And it also talks about the creativity. I learned to paint. I never knew I could paint. Exercise. I used it as an excuse to get a puppy. And now I walk an hour and a half a day. I do weightlifting. I do cardio. I work out at least 2 hours. I've learned to enjoy all sorts of great foods. I have some friends I had to weed out of my lovely garden of friends because they were pretty toxic. But I've made new ones, and I have many old ones. I've joined book clubs. I want others to learn to live with joy and to live well. And that's what the book is really about.
Let's for a moment look at the stigma that surrounds the disease and how offensive it is, and your life experience, although you've risen above it and reframed how you live. What was it like? Were you asked to get off boards? I mean, you're a distinguished academician, you live it in your mind. What was it like?
You know, I first want to say many understood. I mean, I think everybody I knew was shocked. Friends had suspected something was going on, but maybe just aging. But when I told the board of trustees at the University of Denver, all these, super qualified people cried and expressed their deep love for me. And I heard that time and time again, but the stigma is there. I had people who talked louder to me, and I used to joke, I'm not deaf. I have maybe losing my mind, but I'm not deaf. I had people who asked me to get off boards. And I did have friends who kind of got in this pretend caring mode. And, I like to be asked how I'm doing. But they were like, can I do this? Can I do that? I mean, one has a long time, 10, 15 years. If you're lucky, you can stay pretty healthy. So it's a very mixed bag. And all of a sudden, I got very attentive to jokes about dementia.
Insulted by jokes about dementia.
Mhm.
Rebecca, if people were to just meet you now without knowing that you were living with dementia, does it ever make you, and this is a very personal question, so I apologize up front, do you ever regret knowing that you had the disease as early as you did? Could you have stretched it out? I mean, everyone wants to stretch out the bright side to their life.
No, I never regret it for 1 second. Knowledge is power. That's my mantra. The more I know, the more I can do to take care of myself. Being forced to retire, I mean, they didn't make me retire, but I didn't want to start making mistakes in that kind of a job. I can now spend time with my husband. He put up with a very busy, preoccupied working wife for years. I could spend time with my son and my friends. I can get my affairs in order, and I can try to give back. I've become an Alzheimer's advocate. And most of all, life is made for joy.
Mm.
I mean, I really do think, God or the ultimate put us on earth to enjoy creation.
You're a theologian. How does spirituality support how you've managed to reframe the prism of this disease?
Well, I have had to reframe it, and I think we all do. Once you get this diagnosis and your care partners, you have to reframe your life. It's caused me to reframe my spirituality and in expanding it, really. I guess I find myself now at this stage kind of having 3 interrelated movements, my own ode to joy, like in Beethoven. The first is very much about abiding, and that's just what I was saying. I don't think I ever took the time just to be open. Walking in the mountains, abiding, being with my loved ones, just seeing the ordinary and the extraordinary. Annie Lamott talks about grace is transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. And I think it's so true. And I think to live with joy is to live in the light and to just open yourself to abiding.
Let's hold that thought, because we are going to be joined by the other guests later, and we will continue that dialogue. Andrea, I'm going to throw it back to you so we can continue and learn more.
Yeah, thank you again, Rebecca and Mel. I'm have to say I'm personally quite touched by what we just heard, and I learned one thing which I try also, and will certainly repeat many times: live with joy. Don't let the disease get you down. I think that's one of the key messages coming out of this dialogue. Now let me welcome Dr. Rachel Buckley to discuss how gender, which we know it does, impacts the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. Rachel, you are Australian, trained at University of Melbourne. So in what way did you actually observe that women look at memory in a different way? When did you get interested in that aspect? Because you are so young.
That's right. My PhD was focused on memory concerns. I was very interested in when people start to notice that the disease is building, as Rebecca very beautifully put it. You do notice signs early. And in fact, women are very in tune with their bodies, particularly so. There's something that we notice coming out of my PhD and other work across the world, that women do really notice changes very, very early on. In addition, actually, there are also changes that happen to memory and other thinking abilities during menopause. These two aren't necessarily linked, but I do think that gives women a primer of how things might change and being much more aware of that. But on top of that, there are more facets to this, because women are also more in tune with other people's bodies too. So often we'll notice in the memory clinic cohorts that we research that women will often bring their spouses when they become concerned about their spouse's memory. And so I think there's lots of components to women noticing changes in memory.
Yeah, so in Boston, under the mentorship of a much admired Professor Reza Sperling, you were encouraged to look at why women are more at risk for Alzheimer's disease than men. What intrigued you most about the biology, and what finally did you find when it comes to some of the markers we are exposed to, tau, amyloids? So what can we say from a biological, biochemical point of perspective?
There are fascinating components to women's risk for Alzheimer's disease, particularly. When we first started looking into this question, it became very clear to us that no one had really looked very deeply at the differences between men and women in their risk for the actual disease in the brain. As you mentioned, and the other speakers have mentioned, there are two hallmark pathologies of Alzheimer's disease: the amyloid plaques in the brain and the tau tangles. And we have some of the largest studies in the world looking at positron emission tomography. We use PET scans to look at amyloid and tau in the brain and see where they're actually lighting up in the brain while people are living. And what we noticed is in those individuals who are all healthy, there are no issues with memory or thinking. What we noticed is that women and men show very similar levels of amyloid plaques. There really is no, in thousands and thousands of scans that we've looked at, there really is no evidence of differences in amyloid. But where things start to show very, very big differences is in tau tangles. We see that across a lot of regions of the brain, women show much higher levels of tau, which led us to think, okay, what could be driving this? And this is where we get from the twinkle to the wrinkle. The first element that we were really interested in is menopause, this sort of midlife changing cessation of hormones and other aspects that really cause a huge event in a woman's life. And what we started to notice in some of our data, and in fact, other data across the world, is that menopause might actually, elements of menopause might be playing a key role in driving higher levels of tau in women. The other aspect is the X chromosome. The really fascinating thing about that is that it's telling us a story. The X chromosome is telling us a story, not just about susceptibility, but also about resilience. And I think harkening back to the joy aspect of what we've been discussing, I don't think that this story about women's health and Alzheimer's disease is just about vulnerability or susceptibility. There is actually also a very strong story to tell about resilience too.
Thank you. So you spoke already about the menopause. So what actually contributes during this menopause phase to this enhanced tau tangled building, which obviously are correlating very well with cognitive decline? What is it? Is it change in estrogens? Is it hormone therapy? Is it change in sleep? What are the factors driving potentially this tau pathology?
I'm so glad that you asked me that question, because actually right now we're still not entirely clear. And I think that's why we're at such a fantastic and critical point in research right now. I think we've got some really interesting data to hand. There is definitely an argument to be made that earlier age at menopause, whether it's via surgery or just it happens naturally, is linked with higher risk for both the dementia and also the proteins in the brain. We've noticed that earlier age in menopause is associated with higher level of those tau tangles I was referring to earlier, but also other studies have shown that earlier age at menopause is associated with higher rates of progression to the dementia later in life. There is also a lot of interesting evidence coming out of clinical trials to suggest that hormone therapy might play a role, but there are a lot of nuances associated with that. It is not all hormone therapy, and it is not all women who take hormone therapy that increases risk. And we can touch on that later if you're interested. But there are other aspects of menopause as well. As you touched upon, changing sleep is a huge marker of menopause. And we know that sleep is very closely linked with Alzheimer's disease risk, both in the midlife and in later life. We also know that there is hugely skyrocketing changes in cardiovascular risk. And we know cardiovascular risk is a big risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And we also know that there are other changes that really affect mood. There's hot flashes. Other symptoms of menopause can also play a role. We've also noticed in some early data that also the severity of symptoms might be of interest too. So there's a milieu of things happening in menopause that I think need to be really considered, and we need to understand how all of these factors are playing a role together, combined in the midlife to influence disease risk down the line.
Do you think there's enough research being done on this aspect? I mean, I have quite often discussions with friends in the scientific field who are asking question, hormone therapy, yes or no? So what recommendations would you actually give to women at the age of 40 to 50, and what recommendation maybe to the 60 plus?
So I'll start off with the question of what would I recommend. It's a wonderful question. And first off, I would say I'm not a clinician, so I'm going to be coming at this from the research. The data that we know is exactly what I said before, which is we know that hormone therapy can increase risk, but most of those largest clinical trials on hormone therapy were actually targeting a specific question, which was, if you initiate hormone therapy later in life, say 65 and over, is that associated with increased comorbidities? Dementia was one of those. And what they found is that in women who initiated hormone therapy after the age of approximately 65, there was almost doubled risk for dementia on certain formulations. Now, this was fascinating to people because they thought that estrogens would be protective. But what we now know is that the story is a lot more nuanced. That if you are taking hormone therapy very, very close in time to your age at menopause, that your risk for dementia is not increased. We do not see significant changes in cognition over a period of 10 years, 15 years. And we don't necessarily see all these other risks involving pathology. Mind you, in saying that, there is a lot that we don't know. A lot of the deeply characterized cohorts for Alzheimer's disease, the cohorts that I tend to work with, we don't ask questions about menopause. It is not traditionally asked. We don't tend to focus on women's health. And so there's a lot of unknowns in these really well-characterized cohorts. On the other side, there are some incredible cohorts of hormone therapy and menopause, but these women are often younger. And one thing that we really want to do is try to get these women to come back when they're in their 70s and see if there is increased risk for pathology as well as dementia. This is a study that has not yet been done. This is a study that we would like to do across America, and in fact, even across Europe if we can. And this addresses your first point, which is what more is there to be done? And that is low-hanging fruit in my mind.
Fascinating. Thank you, Rachel, for your insights and leadership in the field. We come back to this because I have, of course, a very important question, and which is how can lifestyle changes contribute to this journey? But let me now call up all the guests of today and discuss with them some final thoughts and aspects of today's dialogue. And I start again with Giovanni. One of the things I hear so often, being not a clinician, just a scientist, is when you are diagnosed with Alzheimer, what do I do? As Rebecca nicely said, well, I go to my neurologist and then I get maybe not so much help. So how can patients and doctors work together to improve the communication for early diagnosis? How can the doctors help the patients to deal with it, to enjoy life?
Andrea, let me give you a high-level answer. There's a number of practical advice that one could give, but let me give you a high-level answer. I believe that what we should do, we specialists and patients and society, we should develop a common narrative of what Alzheimer's disease consists of. Why am I saying that? I perceive a wide gap between the narrative of a part of clinicians and scientists who believe that Alzheimer's means being biomarker positive. You have amyloid in your brain, you have Alzheimer's. No matter if you go skiing twice or 3 times per week, you have Alzheimer's. And there's, on the other hand, there's civil society, the lay people who believe that having Alzheimer's means not recognizing your dear ones. So this is of course, in between, there's a whole, there's many nuances, but I believe that this narrative gap does exist, and it's bad for communication. It's bad for science. It's bad for treating patients. It's bad for progressing together to developing meaningful answer to patients' need. Whether these answers are monoclonal antibodies or other future pharmacological and non-pharmacological strategies. What I'm saying here is that we should work together to close this gap and develop a common narrative of the disease where Alzheimer's is having memory impairment and being biomarker positive, and where biomarker positivity alone with normal memory is a risk condition. It's not disease. This is the foundation of doing prevention, of doing secondary prevention.
Yeah, excellent. Let me come back now to Rebecca, who impressed me so much by, I think, giving hope, giving encouragement to the patients. How do the newly diagnosed people wish and deserve to be treated? How should we deal with them?
It's a really good question. And in part, I think probably every individual is a little different in terms of how they want their friends or the general public to deal with them. But I want to begin with doctors, because I just want to say again and again, respect, educate, be caring. To have had one doctor not emotionally supportive, what a world of difference it meant to me to have a doctor emotionally supportive, and who gave me all the material I could, who led me on the path. Second, you know, I want people to be respectful. I'm still alive. I'm living with joy. I have curiosity. I have interest. I want people to see me as human. And I think that most of us with Alzheimer's, or all of us, would say that. Third, I like people when they're curious. You know, ask about it. I'm fine. Many kind of take me aside and say, do you mind if I ask? I think the more I talk about it, the more we talk about it, the more we write that narrative. And the fourth thing I would say is, you know, understand that all of us are going to get blue. We're going to have down days. We're going to have deep fears, but we can live with joy.
Thank you, Rebecca. Meryl, you took care 24 years in a loving way of your husband who had Alzheimer. What are the biggest lessons you learned from this journey, and what would you recommend to people who are in a similar situation?
Well, Andrea, we all have stories to tell, but based on today's conversation, I think it's of greatest value to focus on the earliest stages of the disease that are most challenging. Giovanni, like you, my husband was a distinguished scientist, but he was in denial and misdiagnosed for close to 5 years. And the paternalistic view of too many doctors, if you can't treat, don't tell, is a tremendous disservice to everyone because it confuses an already challenging and emotionally charged situation. I mean, my view was I would support my husband to maintain his independence for as long as possible while fighting to protect his dignity, which too often drives you both into isolation. So I think you need to learn to live in their reality and in the moment to survive. And my book is called Slow Dancing with a Stranger. The Alzheimer's was the stranger tossing us around, and my husband was becoming the stranger. But there is no fighting the trajectory of the disease. And having done it for 24 years for both my husband and my mother, you need to move with the disease and adapt to support a loved one where they are. I have to say, Rebecca is a role model of what it looks like to own the diagnosis. And I marvel at her bravery because too often we buy into the cruel stigma that both you, Giovanni, and Rebecca have referenced. And with a diagnosis, and this is even true now, becomes an immediate marginalization of an individual, despite what they might be capable of. So we need to collectively find a way not to talk about people as victims, but as living in a disease. We all manage and live in some disease or another. So I think the future reality is that more of us are going to need to live like Rebecca, because to be diagnosed earlier means we have access to the latest treatment. So I think the scientists today have just been remarkable. So thank you for inviting me in as well.
Can I just ask you a personal question, Meryl? Where did you take your strength from? How did you manage? I know you're a strong woman, but this is
I just did. I made it up as I went along. Back in those days, there were no resources. I weaned my husband off of all the medications, walked him 6 hours a day, played opera, played new age music, read him his research, because I knew somewhere, even though he didn't know my name, I could reach him. And I did. I got a man who never sat down. I fed him walking to sit down next to me, just by lowering my voice and teasing him to come closer and closer. And that's when I learned the passion of researchers like Giovanni and like you and Rachel. It's not big showy passion. It is that quiet passion that doesn't let you rest. And that's why, to me, you're rock stars. So
thank you. Rachel, you already touched a little bit on the environmental factors. And as you know, I have a strong interest in food and lifestyle, how it can influence diseases, diabetes, heart diseases, and Alzheimer. So do you think the lifestyle prevention strategies, which we are all learning about, are only good for healthy adults? Or how can they be used for early diagnosed patients? What can we do even on that aspect and actually combine the lifestyle changes with a medication, which is now going to be available?
Yeah, it's a great question. I absolutely think that there is a lot that can be done lifestyle modifying, whether you are young and healthy or whether you are early diagnosed. There are lots of changes that one can make to one's life in order to make it more joyful, but also make it more healthy. And there is no good time like the present. The thing that I've learned through my research is how much I needed to change my own lifestyle. So I run regularly. I am learning a new language. I took up learning about the X chromosome, even though I never knew anything about genetics. I constantly maintain my friendships, and I have a very close family network. And I also follow fasting diets purely because of the research that I've seen in animal models. I think there's a lot that can be done, whether it's early on in life or later in life, which has a huge impact, a profound impact, not only on your sense of well-being, quality of life, but also it can impact the disease. There are very large lifestyle modification clinical trials ongoing at the moment, both in Europe and in America. And they have shown that we can intervene in the way that we live our lives, and it can have, it, albeit modest, but it can have impacts on the disease. And I think these are things that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking not just about what are the therapeutics, what are the drugs that I can take, but also how can I keep my body healthy, my heart healthy, and my mind healthy.
Yeah. How true is this? And I am very pleased actually to see now that these two fields, on one hand, aspects like the finger study of Mia and now medication actually come together. And maybe it's the combination of the two which actually will give us the biggest benefit and the best prevention of this disease. Let me come to my final question, and this is to all of you, and if you could just answer in a short minute. How do you think the recommendation, which includes lifestyle, and the prescription for Alzheimer prevention look like 10 years from now? Giovanni, why don't you start?
Andrea, I believe that in 10 years from now, there will be the second generation memory clinics that I've been mentioning earlier on. This will be clinical services different from the memory clinics that we know, that we're used to be familiar with. They will be offering prevention to persons with no cognitive impairment. In practice, what they'll do is to evaluate the risk of developing Alzheimer's in persons in their 60s and 70s, persons without memory impairment, evaluating the risk with blood biomarkers, and probably in a minority of cases, lumbar puncture and PET markers, but in a minority of them. Then what they will do is to stratify them into those at high risk and those at low risk. And interventions will be carried out in those at high risk. Interventions with what? With what you were mentioning, with anti-amyloid and anti-tau drugs, with nutritional supplements, with transcranial stimulation, probably, with probiotics, with nutritional, with intensive lifestyle interventions, finger-like, Mia style-like, and other strategies that are currently in the development phase. This will allow to optimize, of course, the best results will be achieved with the combination of pharma and non-pharma interventions, but these clinical services will allow to optimize, to optimize the results, to maximize the cost effectiveness, because we will not be able to afford offering risk prevention, a high level of risk reduction to anyone. We will need to personalize interventions only in those at high risk. The grand vision, I'm sure you get the gist now, is to prevent Alzheimer's as we now in 2023 successfully prevent stroke and myocardial infarction. The concept, the vision, the concept is the same, and we are heading towards fulfilling this grand vision.
Thank you, Giovanni. And I'm really looking forward to work together on this one. Rebecca, short answer. What's your view?
Yes.
What can we do
Yes.
for you? I mean, because I'm
Yes. But for those like me who do get diagnosed, I think we'll have hand-tailored medicines. Every case will be different, and lots of sophistication about lifestyle intervention. And my grand vision is that will have also changed the narrative about this disease.
Thank you. Mel, what's your vision?
Well, my husband maintained his brain, and unfortunately, it just didn't matter. I believe in all the preventive strategies because I think we need to be healthy until the science catches up. And kudos to you, Andrea, for your vision and leading the charge to develop a vaccine by 2030. I think it is the only way globally for countries to assure access, equity for all. And the goal is we want our brain span to match our lifespan. That's my quest.
Yeah, well, that's definitely the objective. Rachel.
So my feeling is, if we're talking about what Giovanni's referring to, which is this large scale prevention approach, I think what we really need to think about as well is precision medicine. We're now in this new incredible information era where we have artificial intelligence becoming more to the fore. I think we need to use that, harness it, be able to detect at a very precise level those people who are most at risk and those people who will benefit from certain approaches. Specifically because I'm interested in women's health, I think this precision medicine will actually show and highlight that women do potentially need to be treated differently to men, which has also been found in other medical fields as well.
Thank you. Yeah, after hearing these inspiring testimonies, there are, and you will agree with me, strong reasons for hope. And it's almost a tradition of these dialogues where I always try to close this dialogue with some messages of hope. While the potential broad application of two disease-modifying treatments that delay disease progression might not too far away, we have to advocate for a rapid adaptation of a clinical infrastructure and reimbursement policies. We need to ensure access to these drugs will be provided. The worst thing I would see is that the science finally delivered after a long time, but the patients don't get access to the drugs. And as we all know, the earlier the intervention, the higher the chances for success. Let us hope that our generation might be the last to face untreatable Alzheimer's disease. And with this, I would like to thank you all for joining us today, in particular the panelists. It was exciting, it was touching, it was memorable, and I wish you an excellent day. Thank you very much.